Great.
Good morning. Welcome. I'm Kathleen Roberts. Nice to see you. Thank you for coming and agreeing to make a presentation.
Yeah, and sorry we don't have slides. Thank you all for having us. I'm Layla Bozorg, Chief of Staff at HPD. Happy to be here this morning. I'm going to give just a brief overview of our progress to date under Housing New York and some of the kind of recent policy wins and policy initiatives we've been working on. And then I'm going to turn it over to our Assistant Commissioner, Liz Gomer, to talk a little bit about some of our numbers and some of what we're doing with 421A. So, as you all know, Housing New York is kind of the administration's ambitious plan to build or preserve 200,000 units over 10 years. 80,000 of those are expected to be new construction. 120,000 are expected to be preservation of affordable units. So as of March 31st, we have built or preserved 43,515 affordable apartments under the plan. So that's kind of well above our targets or our kind of expected trajectory of how we're going to achieve the housing plan. Of those 43,515 units, 14,152 are newly constructed, and 29,363 are preservation units. In 2015 alone, we had the kind of highest production year in 25 years since Mayor Koch's plan, and that's in 2015 we had 21,041 homes that were financed. So in addition to the number of homes we've produced, some of our big policy wins, as I'm sure you all are aware, the most notable recently is the passing of mandatory inclusionary housing, MIH. We're very excited about this. It's the most kind of ambitious and progressive policy of its kind in the nation. And so with MIH, you know, we consider MIH the city's framework for creating permanent affordable housing and trying to create economic diversity. So it aims to create permanent affordable housing to low and moderate income households. It requires developers to set aside 25 to 30% of the housing they build as affordable apartments. This is in areas that are either undergoing a neighborhood-wide rezoning or in private applications for upzonings. MIH also, you know, the idea behind it is to leverage the private market to build some of our affordable units. And by leveraging the private market and using kind of the market to cross-subsidize affordable units, that also allows us to use our existing subsidies in more flexible ways and to go deeper with our subsidies where MIH alone may not be able to go that deep. So as I mentioned, MIH will be applied when we do neighborhood-wide rezonings, which Department of City Planning leads those processes. East New York was the first rezoning that was recently approved, and there are 6 other neighborhoods that are currently going through the kind of neighborhood planning process around rezonings, with Department of City Planning again leading those efforts and us working very closely with them. You know, the other key zoning initiative that passed is, I don't know if Department of City Planning is coming to speak to you all, but is zoning for quality and affordability. I can't speak too much to that, but that's another kind of zoning policy that's going to do a lot for us in terms of getting more efficiency and expand affordable housing opportunities, especially for seniors. So in addition to MIH and ZQA, some of the other big policy or smaller, but that go hand in hand with some of our policy goals. Some of the smaller initiatives we've this past year rolled out is we've released something called Laying the Groundwork, which is a set of design considerations for the retail that comes along, retail and community facility spaces that come along with affordable buildings. In the past, we've had some challenges with the retail being built in a way that can effectively be used. So in partnership with the Design Trust, we've put out this report that kind of will help guide, is intended to be kind of guidance and considerations for designing and building better, efficient ground floor spaces. We've also launched the Green Housing Preservation Program, and the purpose of the Green Housing Preservation Program is to help owners of small buildings undertake energy efficiency and water conservation improvements to improve the sustainability and then ultimately the affordability of their buildings. The Green Housing Preservation Program is kind of one of the key new programs that our neighborhood preservation help desks, which is also a new initiative, is out there is out there talking about. So the neighborhood preservation help desks it's a one-stop shop for offering small building owners physical, financial, and technical assistance in exchange for extended affordability. So I think Daniel Hernandez was here speaking to you all last year. He may have talked about the neighborhood planning playbook that we were in process of developing last year. We launched that playbook this year, and it's really serves as kind of our template for how we're out there working with communities now as we plan around housing and rezonings and neighborhood change generally. One last piece I wanted to mention within the Office of Neighborhood Strategies, which Daniel Hernandez, Deputy Commissioner Hernandez leads, we have a new division called the Office of Neighborhood Partnerships, and this was established last year to help lead our commitment to strategic preservation. You know, we've always had our preservation finance divisions under development, which kind of do the processing and are out there promoting the preservation finance loans that get to our preservation numbers. But this new division now, it's one of its sole purposes, or kind of main purposes, is to be out there building our preservation pipeline and taking a new approach to how we're working with landlords, working with tenants, working with communities to understand what the biggest challenges are with preservation, and to come up with new strategies to do proactive preservation. That office is really also serving as a bridge between, you know, HPD is a fairly large agency, and we think about and do preservation in different ways, both between code enforcement and our loan programs. And this new division is really serving as a bridge between these offices that are working on preservation in different ways to make sure we have some more comprehensive strategies for how we're being more effective in bringing things into the preservation pipeline and getting them into regulatory agreements. So some of the things that that division has been working on, they've implemented a citywide pilot strategy to pool owners who would benefit from HPD projects. So they've recently done mailings to all J51 owners of J51s that have tax benefits that are expiring or that recently expired. So they're doing direct outreach to those owners. They're also doing direct outreach to owners of multifamily properties that are going into that have received letters through the tax lien sales 90-day process, or the tax lien sale process once they get to that 90-day letter. They have also been doing mailings, sending information on HPD's preservation programs to all MDR eligible buildings. So they're doing a lot of kind of mailings and direct outreach to owners of properties that we think could potentially be candidates for preservation or that are challenges for preservation. They are piloting a community-based outreach program in partnership with elected officials and community organizations to kind of get elected officials and others more involved on addressing buildings that are coming through our proactive preservation initiative. They've also very recently initiated something called the Problem Buildings Committee. Well, the Problem Buildings Committee has been in existence for about a year since they started, which is internal to HPD, and it works on identifying and coming up with solutions for some of the really difficult projects that we know are rent stabilized, are out there, but are difficult to bring into the regulatory system. So we've had that internal group, and as of this week, actually the first meeting is today, we've opened, we're kind of testing something called the Preservation Advisory Panel, where we have preservation experts from the city coming together and actually working with us on on some of those buildings that are coming through the Problem Buildings Committee to try to problem solve around what are strategies, what are our leverage points, what are the city's leverage points, to try to do more with some of these problem buildings. So we're excited to see how that advisory committee works together and whether it helps kind of build that pipeline for us. We were also, the Division of Neighborhood Preservation is also working with HUD on HUD's task force to identify at-risk HUD buildings or HUD projects that are coming upon the end of their regulatory agreement and coming up with strategies to preserve those, sometimes through HPD's preservation programs. We've recently launched the Neighborhood Help Desk with Enterprise and CPC as part of our resource fairs, and that again is just one way we're out there trying to work with landlords to kind of share what our tools are that might be able to assist their projects and their buildings, and at the same time bring them under regulatory agreements. And we've begun exploring the idea of landlord ambassadors. We currently have housing ambassadors, but we're exploring this idea of landlord ambassadors to provide technical assistance to owners that are interested in engaging with HPD's preservation finance unit but don't necessarily have the technical capacity to do a refinance. So that's kind of the summary of some of our key policy initiatives. We're excited about getting into the third year of Housing New York. And we have some challenges ahead, but we're optimistic still about what we're able to do, at least on the production numbers. So,
I guess the one thing that I just wanted to add was that I think many of you know that in this administration, particularly under Commissioner Vicki Bean's leadership, HPD has really increased and stepped up its focus on compliance, and that's across the board. But as it particularly relates to the Rent Guidelines Board, we are really making every effort to ensure that the requirements of our regulatory agreements on our affordable projects are being carried out, and that we've been doing formal notification of anybody that we see that hasn't been registered or hasn't been in compliance with any of those details, and telling owners that their benefits will be formally revoked if they don't come into compliance. That's in addition to ongoing task force efforts that involves HPD in conjunction with DHCR, both Office of Rent Administration as well as Tenant Protection Unit, and the Attorney General's Office, to be able to focus particularly on properties receiving tax benefits that are not fully in compliance with the requirements to register those units. So that's an ongoing series of investigations and efforts that we are very optimistic will help to improve the conditions for units that are, of course, subject to rent stabilization, regardless of whether or not they're formally part of the affordable housing stock.
Thank you. Do we want to first see if there are questions for Ms. Bozorg on the initiatives? Anyone have questions on the policy initiatives? Yes, Steve.
Yeah, I suspect that some of my colleagues on the board are certainly, their representatives are not particularly happy with MIH, but I do want to compliment HPD on at least the East New York sort of 25% at 60% of AMI. I think for many of us around the table it was a hard decision to make, but I think it's good. Generally, the trend is positive. But I know there was a $12 million set aside for small homes in East New York. And the question is really around accountability and control. And this is all uncharted. I'm just curious what protocol is going to be set up. East Harlem is next and so forth. And I'm sure each one's going to have a different color and flavor. I'm just curious what system's in place for that.
Yeah, so on East New York specifically, with all of the commitments that were made through that process, we've been working with the City Council to, through the Mayor's Office of Operations, have an official tracker of all of those commitments. So that's our main form of accountability on all of the commitments that were made through that process. And so that's something that the City Council, and I believe actually that they're introducing legislation that makes that tracker through the Mayor's Office of Operations local law, essentially. But that's going to be our main, we're going to be working with the other agencies that are part of those commitments and with the community to kind of follow through on each of those commitments that were made. But then in terms of the public accountability, there is going to be this official tracker that is going to be on the Mayor's Office of Operations website, and that I think is going to be updated quarterly as to where we are with the commitments that were made. Yeah.
Just one follow-up, just as Steve's question is, so if you don't meet your commitments, then what?
What was the question? I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
So there's a tracker that says
Yeah.
they have an obligation to spend this much money to build these many units, to build this school, to support these programs. So there's a tracker, but if the tracker says, like in Williamsburg, it said, we're going to build a park after the rezoning happens in Williamsburg, and we're like, oops, we didn't set enough money aside to build the park, so you're not going to get a park. What are the implications of failing to meet your markers in the East New York rezoning?
You know, I mean, that's a tough one. I don't have a good answer for that. I think it's a fair question. I know that we have already immediately started budgeting, building these into our projecting at what point in the fiscal process we're going to be needing the funding. And we have an administration that's really pushing this as well. I know that begs then the next question of what happens when the administration changes over. I don't have a good answer to that either. But the commitments were made because there is a huge need there, but I don't think we'll be able to make the same level or scale of commitment in every rezoning. But this was one that I think all agencies that were part of it took very seriously and understand that these are needs that need to be met, and doing our best to make sure that there's accountability and action on them. So.
Yeah, I have a question, which is the effect of the expiration of 421A on the goals that you have for new housing in particular, and whether you're exploring alternatives to 421A. What are the prospects there? Because we saw in the statistics that there's of course a dramatic decrease in the number of permits issued.
So with that, I don't know, Liz, if you want to speak to that at all, but I know that, so we don't expect it to affect our preservation numbers. On the new construction side, we looked at the past year at the number of projects that we expected to apply for 420, or that we expect to apply for 421A. Or I think we looked at the ones that did apply for 421A in 2014, and about 60% of those would have been eligible for either Article 11 or 420C. So, and that leaves about 40% that would not be eligible for another tax exemption. So there are a lot of projects that go through 421A that could be eligible for another tax incentive. So we do expect to see, if 421A is not renewed, we do expect to see an uptick in Article 11s and 420Cs. I think that the numbers that will be most impacted are those as-of rights, where we depend on that cross-subsidization to get the affordable units. So it will have some impact. It's very difficult for us to estimate right now what that impact will be, because we're still actually bringing in, accepting applications for 421A that were grandfathered in. So we're not seeing that downtick yet, but if it's not renewed, it's hard. We don't know what the actual downtick is right now, and then if it's not renewed, it's hard to estimate right now. But again, about 60,000. 60% of what used 421A in 2014 would have been eligible for either Article 11 or 420C. So that's, it's that other 40% that we are nervous about.
Thank you. Additional questions? Harvey?
So is there a list of buildings that are now getting 421A available? So a tenant who lives in a building is like, I don't know if I'm rent stabilized or not, would be able to look at a list and say, you are, or a list of 421A and J51 buildings that's publicly available?
I'm happy to answer that. So yes, there's a lot of information at a building level, sort of publicly available lookup, if you will. There's a couple of different sources for that. So the New York City Department of Finance has information about tax abatement and exemptions on individual properties. So a tenant could look up whether they're receiving, right, they're in a building that's receiving one of those benefits. And then they're also able to look up whether, of course, their rent is, aside from actually requesting a rent history if they're the current tenant in residence, but they're able to look up on both the HPD website, on the DHCR website, and I believe through Rent Guidelines Board as well, to be able to see if their building is registered.
So on your website, if a building is getting 421A, it'll note it, if you look at the building address, it'll say 421A or J51,
On the Department of Finance
but it won't
site.
list it on, I'm saying, you said HPD. So-
HPD lists whether a building is subject to rent stabilization. It's now part of our HPD info system, so if a tenant, it's the same place that they would go to look up violations or complaints.
So if I go to the HPD website and it says subject to rent regulation, I won't know it's subject to rent regulation because it's 421A or before it's a pre-1974 building, but then I can go to HCR once I have that information. So all your information on 421A and J51 is on your HPD website. Could you put it there?
I'm certainly happy to follow up and see what their plans are. I mean, this is not at all what I do, but I know that they're continuing to build out more information, particularly to try to help apartment residents understand. So I'm happy to follow up and see if that's a viable option.
Maybe I missed a point of clarification. When you talk about preservation, a unit being preserved, can you define that for us? All these programs seem to be focused
Sure.
on preservation.
Yeah, so I think there's two main ways that we think about preservation. One is where there's an existing regulatory agreement in place that is either coming to an end or needs to be, or coming to an end, or where the building is distressed and it has that regulatory agreement and needs to be refinanced, which is an opportunity to then extend it, even though it's not necessarily up for expiration in the next 5 years or so. So there's the extension of the existing regulatory agreements. The other piece of preservation are projects that are not necessarily under a regulatory agreement, but are naturally occurring, affordable. That's where a lot of the small buildings work comes in, or that are rent stabilized and at risk, where we're looking at, think of it as existing buildings, even if it doesn't have a reg agreement on it, but is a candidate for coming into coming in for a finance loan or a rehab loan, that we could then bring it into the regulatory system.
Right. I think very often a lot of people think of our preservation work as rehab work, and certainly a lot of that is rehab of existing stock. But I think it's important to note that we also really focus on buildings that are financially struggling to be able to do financial and underwriting work and be able to ensure that that building is able to continue doing proper maintenance and ongoing investments, while then ensuring that the rents don't escalate as a result of those investments. So we focus
Right.
on existing stock for both financial and physical preservation.
Go ahead, Harvey.
I just had a question around the small homes, because sometimes we hear from landlords that they're struggling in small homes. What size buildings are those for? Are they loan programs or are they grant programs? And how would the small homeowners we're hearing from have access to these programs?
We do have some loan programs through our property disposition and finance program that are intended for small buildings. I don't know exactly whether we have a unit cap on those.
I don't think we do.
But the design of the loan product is meant to serve smaller buildings better. Our green preservation program also does not have, it doesn't say that it's only for small buildings, but right now the folks that are coming in for it, and again, this is one where the product was designed for smaller buildings. The average unit size for buildings that are going through that pipeline right now is about 23 units. But I think generally when we've been talking about small buildings, we're talking about around 5 to 30 units.
And are they loan programs, low interest rate loans? Are they grant programs? What are they?
They're low interest rate loan programs.
And in exchange, you're asking them to be subject to rent regulation, but you're not giving them grants, you're just giving them low interest rate loans.
That's correct, yeah.
Any other questions on the policy initiatives? Looks like no. I think we can.
So, Andrew, we sent over some questions for HCR. I don't know, you said you forwarded to them?
Oh, HPD, yes.
HPD, sorry.
Yeah, and I'll let them.
I can speak to that. So I have some numbers, but I think it may be easier to be able to actually write that all up for you guys. It may be a little easier to digest than me sitting here and reading off numbers. But we do have the list. If there are other follow-ups, I mean, I have notes on a couple of the questions today, so I can add those, but we'll get that to you as quickly as we can.
And if we have questions about your answers, how do we?
You guys know where to find me. I'm happy to follow up.
Okay.
We can also work through, Andrew, if you'd like, if there's specific, we can kind of pass a document back and forth with questions and answers and follow-ups.
Okay, Ms. Galmer.
I was just here actually to speak to that and to be able to answer other questions. I don't have any formal remarks I'm sharing today.
No formal remarks. Okay. Well, I have a question, and I don't know to what extent you're in a position to answer this, but we've received a lot of conflicting information, I would say, and data relating to the issue of the extent to which owners are, quote-unquote, struggling, and the effect of low or no increases in the guidelines. And, I think it's fair to say that the owner group has been urging that the data that we have, which comes largely from the 2014 income expense study, is either outdated or just doesn't simply reflect the reality that many owners are facing in terms of rising expenses and not getting increases, really putting a squeeze on them. On the other hand, we have our PIAC study, which shows that the expenses, particularly fuel expense, went down so dramatically that it arguably was a windfall to owners, at least those who used oil, and that the NOI numbers, overall income and expense numbers, don't support the notion that owners are struggling to cover their costs in a reasonable way. So if there's anything that you could address in terms of your perceptions of sort of what the larger picture is around the income and expense picture, with taking into account these various factors, and what you see, if anything, of the long-term implications of either a rent freeze or low guideline increases, I, for one, would be very interested in getting your perspective.
I mean, I'm happy to take a pass at that from just the research side. So, I mean, obviously, the Rent Guidelines Board work, I think, is very high quality, rigorous. I think it's reliable data. I think, in fact, we don't see increased expenses for owners. I think that what is very difficult is that, in fact, we have a diverse housing stock, and that means that some owners, of course, may be struggling given what their current rent levels are and facing tremendous pressure in certain neighborhoods that are experiencing changes in the market. I think there's always trade-offs that owners make between pushing for rising rents to be able to make that, not through annual increases, but through other mechanisms, of course, that are available as well, versus the investment in the building stock that, of course, HPD and the city is very concerned and want to make sure that obviously buildings stay in good condition and that they're habitable for tenants as well. But I think over the last several years, we've seen continuing rising rents. We're continuing to still see stagnated incomes on the tenant side or across the board, and that expenses have not, across the board, increased dramatically for owners.
Okay, thank you. Other follow-up questions or additional questions for Ms. Galmer? No questions? Okay, thank you both very much.
Sure,
Appreciate
and we'll get you things, I'm hoping, beginning of next week, but otherwise, if there are follow-up questions or additional questions, we're happy to do those too.
Thank you.
One last thing, from the previous, the reports, we are happy to answer questions on 420A affordable too, to the extent they weren't in our original questions, but I know there were questions about the new 420A or most recent round and affordability levels, so if there's anything that HPD can address, just let us know.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Yes, good morning. You are Stephanie Rossoff. Thank you for coming.
There we go. Well, thank you for having me. So I am the data manager at the NYU Furman Center, and we put out an annual report of the state of New York City's housing and neighborhoods. And a few weeks ago, we released our most recent report. So I'm going to go over some of our select findings that have to do with renters and multifamily buildings. And we also, this year, focused on gentrification in New York City. So I'm going to show you a little bit of our findings from that. So our report is on our website. There's a tremendous amount of information. If you're not familiar with it, we do a variety of neighborhood and housing and demographic indicators at the community district level, for the boroughs, and for the city as a whole. So to start, consistent with what we found last year, real median gross rent and real median renter household incomes continue to diverge. So between 2005 and 2014, median gross rent for households in New York increased by 15%. Over the same time period, median renter household income increased by just 2%. In the year between 2013 and 2014, median gross rent rose while real median renter household income declined. So this is a continuing of a trend we found last year as well. So rent reported by residents in the previous slide may not reflect private market conditions for people and households seeking apartments on the private market. So this map shows median listing rent provided by StreetEasy for the community districts in New York City. So in 2014, the median listing rent in New York was about $2,800, but obviously some neighborhoods had significantly higher median listing rents. This is not the same as what households end up entering a lease at, but this is what listed rents are. And so another way to look at affordability in New York City for rental apartments is to say, okay, well, of the apartments that were recently available on the market, what share at different income levels were affordable? So in this graph, for a family or a household making 80% of area median income, which I'd have to look it up, but I think it's about $60,000 for a family of 4. In 2006, they could afford 52% of recently available apartments. But in 2014, that share declined to 40%. And we see this pattern across all income bands. So there's been a decline in the share of recent apartments that families can afford. So another indicator we look at in the State of the City report is completed residential units authorized for occupancy, or C of Os as we sometimes call them. So in these rows, this C of Os rose between 2014 and 2015, but we're still far below our pre-2012 levels. And this graph shows the gray area are 5+ unit buildings, which were 68% of all the certificates of occupancy in 2015. And actually, I should mention, we break this out not at the building size level, but overall by each of the community districts in the back of the book. So you can look there. Another indicator we look at are sales prices. So we do an index of housing price appreciation, and this is for New York City between 2000 and 2015. And we see that, let's see, the 5+ unit buildings appreciated significantly since 2008, 2009. So this is indexed to 2000. I'm sorry, yes. And that rate of increase in price was much higher than condos or the other types of buildings. You can't see the 2 to 4 line is closely aligned with the 1 unit line. And then finally, we don't put this, we didn't release this in the report, but I wanted to have this for you guys today. This is foreclosure filings, so total number of foreclosure filings on 5+ unit buildings in New York City. And so these levels in 2015 were lower than they've ever been. And so the top line, the dashed New York City line, is just the sum of all the borough lines, but you can see the breakout there. And so every year we choose to focus on a different topic, and this year we focused on gentrification. And so gentrification is a term that's used broadly and interchangeably. It has lots of different definitions. But for the purpose of our study, what we did was we said gentrifying neighborhoods in New York City are those that started off lower income in 1990 and then experienced above median neighborhood rent growth. So in this map, this shows the classifications of the 55 subborough neighborhoods in New York City. The dark blue are, actually the dark blue and the light blue are all the neighborhoods that were in the bottom 40th percentile of average household income in 1990. And then the darker blue are those that experienced rent growth above about 18% between 1990 and 2014. So the dark blue are gentrifying, the lighter blue are non-gentrifying, and the gray areas are what we're calling higher income. Those were in the top 60% of neighborhood average income in 1990. And so what does this mean? So the results that I'm going to present shortly are averaged over all the gentrifying neighborhoods. We have 15 of them, but there was a lot of variation among the gentrifying neighborhoods. So this graph shows the percent change in average rent from 1990 to 2014 for the 7 highest rent growth neighborhoods that we've classified as gentrifying. So Williamsburg, Greenpoint had almost an 80% increase in rent over this time period. And I should mention that even though we're focused on gentrifying neighborhoods, as we've defined them, the higher income neighborhoods also experience large increases in rent. So this is all in our report, and I don't have it up here, but neighborhoods like Greenwich Village and Brooklyn Heights and Park Slope all classified as higher income in our report experienced about 50% or more increase in average rent. So rent is going up everywhere across the city, but we're focusing in on these initially lower income neighborhoods first. So what do we find? So first, we find that affordability is starkest, the losses in affordability are starkest for gentrifying neighborhoods. So here's a similar graph to what I showed before for citywide, and this is showing the share of rental units affordable to households at different income levels. And in 2000, 77% of the recently available units were affordable to those households at 80% of area median income. But by 2010, 2014, that share declined dramatically to 48%. In our book, in our report, we have these for the other neighborhood types. The shares fall everywhere, but it's most dramatic in gentrifying neighborhoods. And we see that this is really an issue for these moderate income families. Even at 120% of AMI, we still see a loss, a 9 percentage point loss in the share of units affordable. And so we also dig a little bit deeper into the dynamics of households and demographics in gentrifying versus non-gentrifying and higher income neighborhoods. And so the first notable trend, or one of them, is that the share of non-family households has increased quite a bit in gentrifying neighborhoods. So a non-family household is someone who lives alone or people who live with roommates. So it's basically roommates, singles, those type of households. And so we see that the share has increased a lot by 2010, 2014, more so than the other neighborhoods. And another way to look at this is to say, among those who recently moved that were older than 25, what was their educational attainment? So in gentrifying neighborhoods, 42% of those who recently moved and were older than 25 had a college degree, compared to 19% in non-gentrifying neighborhoods. So if we think that maybe some of the rent increases were driven by movers, we can look at the relative incomes and educational attainment among those groups. And so we see that gentrifying neighborhoods have a higher share of college degrees, which is, of course, correlated with higher incomes. And another way to look at this is to say, what's the age composition of those recent movers? So these are of just adults, and in gentrifying neighborhoods, we find that 61% of recent movers were between 20 and 34, higher than in non-gentrifying neighborhoods and in higher income neighborhoods. So there's more young adults moving in. And lastly, we look a little bit at although not comprehensively, at the type of housing that are in these neighborhoods. So of all the housing units in gentrifying neighborhoods, 12% were public housing. And about 26 to 28% were units in privately owned subsidized buildings. And so, when we talk about affordability, we want to take note of the kind of housing that's there. Presumably, public housing is a permanent type of affordability. A big chunk in gentrifying neighborhoods compared to non-gentrifying and higher income. So that is how we end the analysis. There's a lot more in our report, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Do we have questions for Ms. Rossoff? Yes, Seville.
Yeah, just on that last slide, what's the definition of privately owned subsidized?
Yeah, so those are buildings that have a LIHTC or a HUD financing contract financing arrangement that preserves some of the affordability. Those are in our subsidized housing information database that we have, or preservation database that we have on our website.
So that doesn't include rent stabilized?
It does not. It would be great to do that, so hopefully we can soon.
Okay.
It would include 80/20s that have a LIHTC component in them.
Exactly.
Which was all the previous 14 years of construction.
Yeah, so there is overlap, certainly, but we can't single out units. And in fact, we only know for a building what kind of financing structure it has, so we have to sort of make assumptions about the number of units in those buildings that were affordable, if it's an 80-20, for example.
Did you cross-reference neighborhood, gentrifying neighborhoods because you could see in neighborhoods, because we have it broken down, the stock of rent-stabilized housing and the change in the stock of rent-stabilized housing in relationship to having college-educated, higher income, younger people moving in. Have you looked at that cross-connection at all?
We haven't. That would be great too. So maybe that can be part of the next stage.
Because I don't know, maybe we could do it too. I mean, if we have this report with their data, and we share with the data that says, okay, in these 15 neighborhoods, this is what's happened. There's younger people who are college educated, higher income, paying higher rents. In those 15 neighborhoods, what's the change in rent stabilization data, and maybe overlay that information to see the impact this has on the rent stabilized housing stock.
Yeah, currently they just summarize it at the borough level. We'd have to ask them to go back and do it at a sub-borough level.
I thought we did sub-boroughs, because we asked that in the past. We asked for neighborhood specific, and we got it broken down by neighborhood.
That's HVS data. That's HVS data.
We can provide a lot of this at the sub-borough level if you're interested.
Yeah, but he's referring to specific data that was in our changes report. That's from DHCR, the ones that are coming out, right? Unless I'm misunderstanding the question.
Yeah, I'm thinking maybe we don't have it, but maybe if we can figure out, we know what we had units of rent stabilization, we know where we've theory lost the 270,000 units, and how do they use overlap to the gentrifying neighborhoods?
Yeah, we don't have the data by sub-borough. We only have it by borough level. So we can't identify those units in the gentrifying neighborhoods. I mean, going forward, we could ask for sub-borough data. They don't give us that. They give us a summary at the borough levels.
And Stephanie, I hear you right that the report currently doesn't cross-reference with the lists of rent-stabilized.
It does not.
Okay, yeah.
Just a point, you're using ACS data, which they don't break out stabilized units in ACS data.
Right.
So that's why I'm assuming that's why you haven't. It's all rental units, and that's all they can go from.
Exactly.
It's frustrating because we have the same problem. But
we can proxy a little bit in the sense that that's why we use that recently available apartments. So those are of people who recently moved within the last 12 months, and they're more likely to be in a market rate apartment. So that's how we use ACS to. It's not great, but it's an approximation.
In theory, is there a way to, trying to get at Harvey's question, is there a way to sort of take the findings that you guys have and then somehow overlay, maybe, if not from what we have, but from the list of the rent-stabilized buildings that HPD and Department of Finance were just referencing? Is there basically, I'm trying to get at the same thing, is how can we sort of start populating where the rent-stabilized buildings are mostly tend to be located relative to what your findings are on
that report breaks down, and we've done this before, where the units through the HVS you can identify as rent-stabilized.
We can do that too.
So we could say that, in 2011 there were X number of rent-stabilized units, and then we could say in those 15, I'm sorry, not the 50, how many were sub-boroughs that had gentrification?
There were 15 of the 55.
So you could then say, okay, are the levels of stabilization the same? And we could do it that way. Yeah, we could take a look at that.
They also break it down by community board. So you can look at a community board and see how many rent-stabilized units there an average are. So like community board 4 in the Bronx, it's like 78 or something.
Yeah, the only issue there, sub-borough and community board are not exactly the same. So there's some issues. I mean, I guess you could make some assumptions. They're not. It depends on the particular sub-borough, how close it is to the community board, but we could certainly take a look at those.
I'd say whatever's easier, but something that speaks to this sort of sense of overlap between.
But you're saying doing that up through the 2014 data?
Yeah, I mean, we could go back. I don't know how far we want to go back, but if their study is through gentrification, through yeah, but you're making comparisons to see where the units levels are. So, I mean, we could go back. The study goes back to 1990, I guess, right? So,
It goes back
Yes.
further. I think the data
Yeah,
is
you
easier
can
to
go back
work
to
with.
91 with
Yeah.
the HVS, I guess. I don't know if that file is digital, actually, but
Probably not.
probably not. But we could certainly go back to like,
Yeah.
2002
2000.
maybe, or something like that, see where we're
Yeah.
losing those. Or maybe 94 is when destabilization really kicked in, so maybe back to 1994. But we could do that for those neighborhoods.
Slightly different topic. So the definition that you use for gentrifying neighborhoods is baselined on 1990, right?
Yes.
Do you have any sort of intuition or sense about what that looks like if we baseline it sort of more recent, like of those neighborhoods, what are the more recent ones that are sort of rapidly changing, or is it basically the same?
That's a good question. I'd have to look.
Uh-huh.
Though I don't think it would be so dissimilar.
Okay, right. Okay, but
Yeah.
broad brushstrokes.
Yeah.
So if we baselined it, say like 2000 or 2005, or I don't know.
Right.
what,
No,
but-
I know what you're saying. I'd have to look.
Okay.
I can look, but I don't think it would be.
Okay,
It would be
great.
that different.
Yeah.
It wouldn't surprise me if there is going to be a correlation with loss of rent-stabilized housing because of the so-called nomad phenomenon, which is that younger people move more frequently, and therefore rents rise more rapidly due to vacancy decontrol. And if you've got a younger population that's moving into these areas and there's a lot of turnover, that can drive loss of regulated units. That's one of the things that at least some people have identified to me as one of the reasons why Manhattan has had so much more vacancy decontrol than other boroughs, and that Brooklyn is fast catching up in that respect.
I mean, there's also this phenomenon of people who are rent stabilized. I mean, there's just a landlord 2 weeks ago, Furman was arrested and for 20 counts of, violations because there's an active engagement of some landlords, not all, in the tactics of harassment and displacement, and that's connected to gentrification. That's an interesting fact. I mean, there's this phenomenon of predatory landlords who are over-leveraging buildings, and the only way they make their rent rolls is to increase their rent rolls, so they have to get the low-rent stabilized tenants out to bring in higher income, for NYU students. So it's a phenomenon that exists, but what the
Well,
question
that
is,
pressure
where does
is
it come from?
definitely there. I mean, if you're going to be less likely to try to get rid of your rent-stabilized tenants if you can get more rent from a non-stabilized tenant.
So one thing we look at, and it's in the report, is we look at court filings for non-payment of rent. We actually find fairly stable levels across all the neighborhood types. We don't at least pick it up in the court data. So any ideas on how to get at that from a data perspective are appreciated.
Yeah, I mean, we've been looking at the Department of Buildings filings and the ideas of how construction is related as a tool of harassment to engage tenants who are there to feel harassed and displaced. And while housing court filings have not been up, actually they're down.
Yeah.
The number of cases which have a court appearances, those numbers are up, and that the holdovers in certain neighborhoods are up higher than they are the non-payment cases. In certain neighborhoods, non-payment cases have traditionally been higher, but holdovers have now gone up in certain neighborhoods, which is a sign of using that case as a tool.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, look at that.
So I have a question about, of the 55 neighborhoods you looked at, how many of them were rezoned? And are those who were rezoned gentrifying neighborhoods that you identified?
I do not have the answer to that. The 55 neighborhoods are the 55 subboroughs. I mean, we can look at that.
That'd be
We haven't
great
overlaid that.
to-
That's a good
to
idea.
get.
Yeah.
I didn't hear your question, Shayla. Could you repeat it?
Oh, so out of the 55 neighborhoods or subboroughs, how many of them were rezoned and how many of those were identified as gentrifying neighborhoods from their report? So to get that, at that.
Right.
You can take that one, Stephanie.
I'm not sure, but that should be presumably easy to find out.
Okay. Other questions for Ms.
I just
Foster?
have just one quick, the neighborhood change database, what is that?
That is this is little data weeds here. That's a data set that is census tract level data that's consistent geography over time from 1970 to 2010.
Okay.
So census tracts change, and actually in order for us to study these neighborhoods, we want to keep consistent boundaries over time, and they do change. So we use that database, which is census data that's been normalized to the same geographic boundaries.
Okay, thank you very
Great.
much for coming in.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
So the table is open for general discussion. Any questions, observations, requests, et cetera?
I just have one thing. We talked about at the public hearings, having laptops are available for people. You said you didn't want to take people's emails and sign them up for notices.
Right.
But you said about potentially having laptops and stuff. I just wanted to follow up to
Yeah,
see.
if they want to get online, sign up, okay.
So are you going to be able to do that for the Queens, so starting with the Queens hearing?
We will get service, yes, for the laptop.
You'll what?
We just need to get service, phone service, basically. Unless they have a Wi-Fi.
I can bring you a hotspot.
Oh.
I'll just bring a hotspot.
Oh, okay, we could do it that way.
Just remind me to bring my hotspot.
Hotspot.
And maybe, can I also just ask about interpretation and translation? So,
Currently, we have interpretation of Spanish at all the hearings. Simultation, we're hiring another for the simultation in the Bronx. So we'll try that out, see if it works in the Bronx. And then we have, in the Queens hearing, we're getting Korean, Hindu, and Bengali. But the Manhattan hearing... Hindi?
Hindu.
Yes. You had spoken to someone regarding Mandarin, I believe, coming to the Midtown hearing. And if you can give me their contact information.
yeah, there was a conversation about like how that person would get paid, so I feel like I still have to coordinate.
All right, let's
Maybe just get you their contact information and you
maybe
can figure it out.
maybe I could talk to them directly. if
Because
you
we
can-
know when the Mandarin speakers are coming.
Yeah, that would
with
be
the organizer,
helpful.
so we could just have them be there for that period of time.
Yeah, that would be great. So if you could, we could, and if they have someone, just let us know that they've used. That's fine with me. But we just need the information.
So it'll be interpretation in Upper Manhattan, Bronx, and Queens for multiple languages simultaneous only in the Bronx?
But we're trying the simultaneous in the Bronx, right? And Brooklyn will have interpreter,
Are
obviously.
you bringing headsets in for how we?
are bringing Could we identify maybe at the, update the, I know this is going to be something completely new, but in the schedule, what kind of interpretation we'll have so that folks that are looking at it actually know what hearing might be best fit for them, and also to encourage folks who speak those languages or who are monolingual speakers to actually come and testify in front of us. So we're actually using the interpretation to the best we can.
I mean, to add it to the website and the notices, which kind of translation will be provided?
Just because I think that, I didn't know that we had actually gotten a confirmation for Korean and even Bengali in the Queens one, so I hadn't been announcing that to folks. And so folks who are organized will know, but folks who aren't wouldn't necessarily know if they're interested in maybe attending and get a notice or something. I think that's just useful information to have on the website.
So we should, and then add to that whatever comes out of talking to this Mandarin person, although it sounds as though that we wanted to try to keep that to this one group that's already requested. Yeah, so I don't know if we want to advertise Mandarin at the Midtown Manhattan.
If we do get a time, we could just
We could
say
put
that
Mandarin
interpreter will
for
be
that
there for this
particular
period of time.
time.
And I would encourage people to come if they want to.
Yeah, is that a problem? Okay.
Yes.
And not just the website, are you going to then, for the emails you have, you'll send out email notification of the update?
Yeah, we're going to do another email blast, and we'll list the hearings and what's that, everything. Yeah, we are going to do that, if not today, tomorrow.
Okay. And we are all expected to do book reports on evicted. That's right. He's going to give us exam numbers, and then he's going to blind us blind. We can have a book club.
We need a motion to adjourn?
Yes, we do.
I make a motion to adjourn?
Thank you. We are adjourned.